Greetings. I am Dr. Ronald Caraveau. Welcome to my workshop on Measure What You Value and Value What You Measure. The presentation today is in video format rather than interactive due to scheduling issues on my part. Now, the workshop slides will be made available on the organization website. I think they said for about 300 days. So let's get started. Here's a little bit of background on me. Do have a PhD in educational psychology, measurement, and methodology. I have teaching experience in the public school system and at the university level as an associate professor. But I've had a lot of administration experience at the school district and State Department levels. At the school district as a director of assessment, and at the State Department as a director of standards and assessment. I've also worked for an international corporation, test development, as a test development manager, and I've got a lot of experience with university accreditation. I've consulted with schools, school districts, colleges, universities, medical schools, and test companies. I've given a lot of conference presentations at home and abroad, and I am published. I'm an author, co-author, and chapter contributor, and I have 2 online assessment programs. Now, through all these experiences, I gathered the information that I've presented and worked on, and I've put it all into one of my books called Connecting the Dots, Developing Student Learning Outcomes and Outcome-Based Assessments. You see the cover here of the 2nd edition, and it's published by Stylus Publications. So I'll be making references from the book and giving credit to Stylus on the copyrights where necessary. Let's start with an outcome-based model to get us all on the same page. Of course, the base for all of us as outcomes folks is the outcomes. And I prefer outcome statements, and we'll talk about that some. Now, we're talking about words when we talk about outcomes, and there are many sources for outcomes and outcome statements. They're online. Universities have banks of them. Departments have banks. In the elementary school system, there's usually a district office where there are also some often required outcomes. And they all have some type of organized structure, so we'll talk about that too. But most importantly, and the reason I have guidelines underlined, is because that's what we're talking about today. The guidelines to develop good outcome statements. And good means that they can produce valid results and be used for assessments. So the assessments I'm talking about today are selected response, which is in this case multiple choice, because there are various selected response types of items, and constructed response, which today we'll be talking about an extended written response. And what we want from all of these assessments is information, some results that we can use to make decisions. But we want it to be valid results. And that's why we'll talk about guidelines, because the guidelines are what drive the item development and give validity to the assessments after those items are used. And of course they interrelate. We want to assess what we say we're going to teach. And the third component, instructional strategies and learning strategies, are of course directly connected to outcome statements. We need to teach what the students are told they're supposed to learn. And these instructional and learning strategies also are directly associated with assessments because, again, we need to assess what we're teaching and teach what we say we're going to assess. So that's just the the logic of all this. And then there comes in the student, and I'm representing them with this brain. And there are learning strategies that they need to apply. So that'll be the last part that we talk about in this workshop. Now, formative quizzing is extremely important, and I put it next to the brain because it's extremely important for learning. And you'll be taking some formative quizzes as we go along to help you get a better handle on some of these guidelines, because there are a lot of them. So moving ahead, we're going to be talking about, again, selected responses, and those are, of course, where the student selects from the answer choices, the multiple choice in this case, and they're considered to be, that's considered to be objective testing because there are no raters. The answer is either right or wrong. Whereas in constructed response, the student constructs the written response, or maybe performs or does a project, and there's a rubric to score that. And it's considered subjective because you need raters to score the rubric, and anytime you get someone reading a rubric and making a score based on what they think that outcome, that rubric cell is saying, some subjectivity enters. So we have to keep that in mind. So here are properties of test scores, because remember, that's what we're after. Scores that we can use to make decisions, and we want them to be valid so that the decisions we make are valid. So one of the properties that makes them valid is reliability, and that means that scores produced by the test will be consistent. It's an important piece of validity evidence. And then there's the big property, validity. It's the degree to which a score can be used and interpreted as what was intended. And to get to that point, we need validity evidence. And some of that evidence comes from having followed the guidelines for developing the outcomes and the assessments. So let's jump right into guidelines for student learning outcomes first, because we need to get the outcomes first. And we call student learning outcomes often SLOs, with a capital S, capital L, capital O. And it's typically considered to be what students are expected to know and be able to do at the end of your course. In other words, the end product. Now, I like to use the term student learning outcome statements, because that's what they really are, statements. And they're statements that, they should be anyway, statements that clearly state the knowledge, skills, attitudes, competencies, and habits of mind that students are expected to acquire. Now, a lot of times the statements are included in a larger outcome statement, often called a standard. So here are key considerations when creating and evaluating outcomes and assessments. We have to consider the degree of importance of the specific outcome expectation. In other words, how important is it that students be given this particular outcome expectation? And what is the value added to the student's knowledge and abilities when the outcomes are met? What is the student going to get from doing this? And it may be graduation, it may be a report card, it may be a scholarship, it may be a certificate, but there's some value that needs to be added to the knowledge the student needs to get where they want to be going. Now, measurability of the student learning outcome statements is another consideration. And when you get into measurement, it can get pretty deep in the woods, because you get into item analysis and psychometrics. But measurement for us is just going to mean that we have an outcome statement that makes sense, is usable, workable, and we can write items to it. And we also need to consider that we need to develop fair assessments. And fair assessments includes having outcomes that match the assessment, and or it could also the other way around, is assessments match the outcomes, and they all match the instruction. So then it's fair. And also we'll consider more fair things like complexity and broadness of the statements, and that'll all be taken care of. So the last point is how the brain learns, and that's teaching and learning strategies. And we'll talk about that as the last section. Now, all of these components must be well orchestrated in order to obtain valid information for decision making. And that's what we're after, is valid information for decision making. So let's talk about levels of outcome importance. When we write the outcome, is it something that is worth the student being familiar with? Or is it important for them to know and do? If it's just worth being familiar with, that's different than being important to know and do. And finally, and the third level is how enduring is that outcome? Is it intended to be enduring so that students will remember for years what they learned? So those are the levels of outcome importance. Now here are we're beginning the guidelines for writing learning outcomes. And there are quite a few of these. And remember, you'll be able to go back and look at this because this whole presentation will be available on the web. Number one, think of your outcome statements in terms of what, and I'm going to say we because I'll include myself here. We need to think of outcome statements in terms of what we consider to be the most important learning outcomes from the large domain of possible outcomes. The most important from the large domain of possible outcomes, because there's always a large domain for every content area. Number two, it's a good idea to map the primary focal points of our instruction, list it, and course content, so that we will have reference points to write the outcomes to. It's a kind of a guide. And number three, it's good to work from a hierarchical viewpoint in terms of breadth and depth of what we want students to know and be able to do. And we'll also talk in terms of complexity and difficulty. Those are all terms that will be part of writing the outcome statement. And number four, identify what student behavior we would expect to see if a student were to correctly do what the outcome statement requires. Now, that's kind of an interesting thought. What really do we expect the student behavior to be that we can see and measure, and that we would expect if a student were to correctly achieve this outcome? And number five, remember that the test item we build to measure the outcome can be written so that the test item is more difficult or less difficult relative to the difficulty of the outcome statement. And we'll talk more about that. It has to be matched up. Number six, be careful not to pollute the outcome task by mixing in other outcome tasks that are not relevant to the specific task we want to measure. This is what happens in like state standards and when there are large descriptions of the expected learning, there can be several outcome tasks within that one large standard. When I worked for the State Department and the test development companies, that was often an issue. Number seven, think about the difficulty of the outcomes as a group. If all of the outcomes are extremely difficult tasks, the test developed from the outcomes will likely be extremely difficult. And of course, the opposite, if they're all extremely easy tasks, then the outcomes likely be extremely easy. So this also is partly related to the level of education that the student is working on and the type and the curriculum that they're following. Number 8, and this is like a catch-all from what we've been saying. Think in terms of what is important, reasonable, and fair when we develop outcomes and assessments. So with those guidelines in mind, let's take a look at Bloom and Anderson's cognitive domains, and I just put Anderson's up here because they're basically the same except for a couple of the top words there. And notice that there's a complexity, because we use this a lot in developing outcomes. Notice that there's a complexity dimension, and then for each cognitive level, which would go up in complexity as you go up the ladder here, there's also a difficulty level. So it's a two-dimensional approach, but it allows for outcome statements and matching test items to vary in complexity and difficulty. And before we mentioned the words breadth and depth. Now, an outcome statement then, or test item, which has high complexity, can have high or low difficulty. That's the choice of the item writer. And an outcome statement or test item of low complexity can have high or low difficulty. Again, the choice of the item builder. So we asked the question now, where on the cognitive complexity continuum do the SLOs and the items fall? That's just a good general question to always ask. And where on the difficulty continuum does the SLO and item fall? So keep in mind those two ideas all through the rest of our building outcomes and building test items. Now, a couple words that are very used a lot are know and understand. They're used in outcome statements a lot. And let's take a good look at kind of what they mean. Knowing is associated with knowledge, something a student can acquire or become expert at through their experiences, including school experiences, and what they learn in an educational setting. So associated with knowledge. And understanding requires thinking about and using concepts rather than just knowing what the concepts are. And here, for example, we know when it's raining, but we may not understand why it is happening. We may know all the available facts about something, but we may not understand how they interrelate or work collectively as part of a concept. And we may know what someone said, but we may not understand what they said. A couple of other words that we need to get a handle on are recognize and identify, also used a lot in outcome statements and test items. Basically, we have to be able to recognize such things as features and characteristics of something or someone in order to be able to identify the something or someone. For example, in a police lineup of suspects, the witness is asked to either recognize or identify the suspect. And when I watch programs on TV where they have a police lineup, I've heard it both ways. Do you recognize? Do you identify? Well, what is really happening is that the witness first recognizes certain features or characteristics of the suspect so that the witness can then identify the person as the one who committed the crime. So you need to recognize things to be able to make the identification. Here's another example at a more difficult level. This might be in a college or university literature course. Okay, coming back to this, at a more difficult level, this example would be in a literature class where the student is asked to identify a writer by recognizing the features of the text. In other words, we identify something or someone by what we recognize about them. In this case, being able to recognize the features of the text helps with making an identification of who that writer is. And of course, describe and explain are used a lot and also often with written responses, but they can also work as multiple choice items. So describe can be related to recognizing and identifying, because the intent of a description is to relate characteristics or features or properties of something. Now the student could be asked to describe a thing or a concept, process or procedure, event, and so forth. And we would be expected, and the student would be expected to provide facts related to characteristics, features, and properties. Now, to explain what is described would require giving reasons for what is described, including answers to how and why questions. So we can describe something without giving an explanation, but giving an explanation requires describing. For example, we might ask the student to describe the steps in a process, but we would ask the student to explain how the process works. Now, all of these ideas and statements and words all have to be coded somehow, put into an order that we can work with, a structure. And I use a 3-level SLO structure. And I've seen a lot of different types of structures, but in today's world of outcome-based education, there are different levels used, and they all have a place. Most of them are 2 or 3 levels, some more, and it often starts, and this is how I do it, with a goal, a big idea, and I'll code that 1. And then that big idea has to be broken down into sub-goals, which I call general outcomes or general learning outcomes, and code that 1.1. And those sub-goals or general outcomes need to be broken down a little more into specific outcomes, because that's where we write that's where we write the items. So I code that 1.1.1. So what happens is we put the item at this level, and we use the results of that item, the test, to compute a value for this level, and then use this level, because there are usually more of them, to compute a value for the goal. Now, I do a whole workshop on just this, but just get the idea that we need to have structure when we're developing student learning outcomes. So here's an example. The goal could be the student will understand literature, and the general learning outcome, or GLO, would be the student will demonstrate accurate, critical, analytic reading of literature. And of course there would be more general outcomes. There'd probably be a 1.1 and 1.2, 1.3. And notice I put a by here, and you wouldn't leave this in. I have it in just to demonstrate that we can make a sentence out of this. The student will understand literature by demonstrating accurate, critical, analytic reading of literature. So that's one of the things they do to understand. Now, the specific learning outcome statement I represent with the little SLO because we use the large SLO for generally talking about student learning outcomes. So the specific learning outcome, I use a little s. And this says that the student will be able to. So let's make a longer sentence. The student will understand literature by demonstrating accurate, critical, analytic reading of literature, and they will do that by identifying important and supporting details, recognizing assumptions and inferences, identifying sequences of event, and determining the main idea or theme of a passage or piece of literature. In other words, we have one specific learning outcome 1, 2, 3, and 4. So they're able to do these things. With the evidence we have that they can do this is when they can do this, and this is what we test. These are specific enough to write items to. These levels here are not specific enough for that, but because we need to probably give a value on that, we can use this test data and information to calculate these values, which we're not going to do today, but just so you know, it can be done. One thing that we do need to do is have a test blueprint or some focal points that we want to target when we write our items. And we talked about item difficulty before, cognitive difficulty. So these would be the item difficulties. It could be a low, medium, or high difficult item. And the lows could be in the cognitive category of literal, factual recall, and medium difficulty might be interpreting and making inferences, and the high difficulty might be critical thinking and evaluation. Now, the types of items, MC stands for multiple choice. So there are multiple choices measuring that, multiple choices measuring that, multiple choices measuring that. And there can also be constructed response items, short written responses or extended written responses. And also surveys. Surveys can be very useful. So here we know we have two goals, and we have some GLOs underneath those goals. And now we want to figure out how many items do we probably need to measure that. Well, it depends on how difficult these goals are, and because you'll be writing your items, your outcomes to that. So you'll need possibly one item to measure this goal, GLO, 3 for that, 2 for that, and altogether 6, and etc. for the rest of these goals. Now, the outcome statements are what are going to drive what these are. And as you're building, it's best as you're building the outcome statements and the test items together to then reference them on this blueprint. And I always recommend, if you can, when you construct the multiple choice, when you construct your outcome statements, figure out how that, what type of item you need to measure it, and even possibly write the item. Sometimes that's hard to do, but if you can, in the long run, it pays off. And so these are the items per cognitive level then. So you'd know on your test you'd have 9 low cognitive items, 8 mediums, and 6 highs. And basically you have this blueprint and then you fill it in. So you do the outcomes, items, and at the same time, hopefully, you can be filling this in. But you do need these reference points. And that's all we'll say about that procedure. Now, I do have online an outcomes and assessment.tools site. That it's www.outcomesassessment.tools. And there you can build item statements in that 3-level order, and you just type in the statement, and you can and wherever you put it, you can automatically readjust it, and it automatically will make the structure that we just talked about, the 3 levels. So it's pretty helpful when you start writing your outcome statements. And then it'll take that structure and automatically put it in another tool that allows you to write test items to each of those outcome statements. And that's where you can look back on your blueprint and see, well, how many do I really need for this or that, or this will guide the cells in the blueprint. Okay, I know I need to have these statements, I know I need to have these items, so I'll go back and fill those into my plan, my test plan, my blueprint. And there's also a quiz builder that you can these items will all show up as an item bank, and you can pull from the item bank automatically and build a quiz. So this might be helpful to you, and it's free. So now let's move on to the formative test, for your formative test, and it's on selecting outcome levels. So remember, the formative test is just to find out if you are learning, not that you have learned. That would be the summative test. So formative tests should never be graded. You might put a grade on it just to inform the student, well, this is about how well you did, but that shouldn't count as toward any final grade. You're giving the formative tests so that they'll do really well on the summative test. So each formative test will be adding to the student's knowledge and understanding, so that when it comes to the final summative test to see have they learned, that's the reward. And an A or a B on a summative test shouldn't be brought down because the student had a C or a D or an F on a formative test, which was covering the same material. Okay, as you can tell, this is kind of a strong point with me. So let's look at how you do with selecting outcome levels. Number one, the outcome is identify causes for the Great Depression. So would you call that a goal? Would you classify that as a goal, a GLO, or an SLO? Okay, identify is pretty specific, so if you chose SLO, that would be correct. How about number two? And that would be an SLO, because the word recognize is very specific. How about determine? Okay, you have an option here, because the SLO could be written specific enough to give one atom with the bond angle and ask just about, or one molecule and just ask about that one, or it could be more of them, or it could be parts of them that would lead up to helping them determine, and then that would be a GLO. The lesson here is we're not strictly driven by whether to have to make it either or. So there's some flexibility with the types of outcomes. Number four. Okay, well, think critically is really a big thing, so it's pretty much going to be a goal. But could have been broken down. It says think critically and logically. I think that they're pretty much the same thing, but you could break it down into two GLOs, and that would work. And then you could put this at the GLO level. You could also say think critically and logically about the historical issues, and think critically and logically about the current issues. And if you could do that, they would be at the GLO level, and then you could say, since you can think critically and logically about historical and the second point, think critically and logically about current issues, I can put that information together and put it under a goal of something like understand historical and current issues. See how that's how that works. Okay, how about number 5? Now, there's a lot of stuff in there, but the key word is understand, so we're at the goal level. So, and remember, if it's a goal, it can always be broken down. So in this case, we could understand theories of atomic orbitals or molecular orbitals. We could also break each of those down into questions about shape, energy, and orientation separately, and they would be SLOs. Number 6. Okay, we probably all went for GLO because it says explain. And that works because explain indicates writing. And what you'll learn later as we go along is that written responses are always measured at this GLO level. So when we write the SLOs and the GLOs, we put this GLO in the rubric. And we'll talk more about that. But it could also be broken down. Explain could be broken down and to smaller pieces and possibly be also SLOs. And because you'd still have to be able to explain to understand, but you could have some SLOs at that level too. And I'll give an illustration of that in a minute here. Okay, number 7, describe. Pretty much that's an SLO. Although, let me go back up there a second. You could say, I want you to write it down, and then it would make it a GLO. But in this case, what I had in mind was you would give it, which description is correct for a covalent bond that is formed in a specific compound. And that would keep it at the SLO level. Number 8. Okay, there's the biggie word. So I'm sure you all chose goal. Now, we could break it down to a GLO level by looking at steps and purpose and measure that separately. And the GLO would be know the steps, know the purpose. And if they know the steps and purpose, then we infer that they understand. And know the steps could be broken down to how do you know the steps? Because you can identify the steps. How do you know the purpose? Because you can explain the purpose. And explain there, again, would be something that you'd have to consider. Did I want it written or did I want it in a multiple choice format? Because it'll work either way. Number 9. Okay, now apply is always an interesting word because it could be at the GLO level, which probably most of you chose, but it could also be at the goal level, and it could also be broken down and at the SLO level. And we could spend time doing that, but just for our purposes today, just recognize that there is this flexibility. Number 10. Compare. That's always an interesting word. Typically, that's going to be a GLO. And it could be done with SLOs, but you're probably going to want something written and so that you can have a measures. Those are a lot of things to measure there, and you can capture it with the written response. So typically it would be a GLO. Now here's a little example of a completed set of outcomes. The GLO was to understand the United States Internal Revenue Collection System. Well, to do that, the students needed to know the components, and they needed to know the process, and they needed to demonstrate a knowledge of formats. And to be able to determine that they know, this so that we can say, well, if they know this stuff, then I'm going to pretty well figure they understand. We need to break it down to those SLO levels. So if the student can describe and identify and recognize stuff, then we'll figure they know this. And if they can explain, compare, and explain, then they know that. And if they can compare and apply, and here we're getting a little bit higher level here, but there could still be SLOs, and that will indicate that they can demonstrate a knowledge. Because when you say demonstrate a knowledge, that's probably going to have to be written. So this is just an example of how the model works. So now let's move into, we've looked at the whole, we've looked at the outcome statements. Now let's look into the selected response item, the multiple choice item. Because it's an animal all to itself. And writing a well-phrased multiple choice test question with one absolutely correct answer plus other plausible but incorrect answer choices is not an easy task. So we have to follow the guidelines, and the guidelines must be followed. Remember, we said guidelines are extremely important to follow, because if you don't follow them, you have a flawed item, and flawed multiple choice items are up to 15 percentage points more difficult than items that conform to standard item writing principles when testing the same content. And also, it would have median passing rates about 3.5 percentage points lower for flawed items as compared to standard items. And this is based on research by Downing and meta-research, and just it's very well backed up by all the writers, experts in the field. So here are some advantages of a multiple choice test, and some may seem a little bit wimpy, but actually they're very important because of the way the students think. The actual answer is visible. Okay, that's obvious. Why is that an advantage? Because in many cases, a student may very well know the answer to a question, but they are unable to recall it due to issues with memory or feeling pressured in an exam situation. And remember, we're trying to find out, do they know that answer? So we don't want to restrict their ability to do that, and so the multiple choice has this advantage. And seeing the answer could well trigger a student's memory to enable them to give a correct answer if it is eluding them. Now, also, and this is a big advantage, multiple choice questions are short, which means that more of them can be posed in any test situation to give a student a more thorough examination. You can put in a lot of multiple choice questions and get them scored quickly compared to one written response. I was hired by a medical school in Denmark, the Aarhus University, that's where the students went to get their medical degrees. And in all this was, I guess 7 or 8 years ago, and they had never given multiple choice answers. They only had given written responses. The faculty didn't even really know what a multiple choice question how it functioned, what it looked like. But the governing board decided that the written responses weren't giving them enough information to make decisions about the students. So I spent 2 weeks with them showing them how to do multiple choice items. They got really good at it, and it worked out really well for them. And it's interesting, 2 of the other countries in that area never used multiple choice answers either. It was always written. So let's look at the anatomy of a multiple choice item, because like I said, it's a unique animal. This whole thing is the test item. And a lot of times we say, I have 20 questions on my test. But what we're really meaning is I have 20 test items on my test. Because the whole thing is the item. This is a question. It's also called a stem. And then we have the three options. I know you're all familiar with this. I'm just trying to zero in a little bit more on the anatomy. So you have answer choice and answer options, and three of them. And of course the asterisk means that's the correct answer or the keyed response. And it has to be the absolutely positively correct answer. None of these other answer choices are the absolutely positively correct answer. And they are called foils or distractors. And they have to, because if a student really knows that A is the answer, they're not going to be foiled or distracted or fooled by B and C. And if a student chooses B or C, it's a pretty good indication they probably really don't know that A is the correct answer. But the foils, as it says, must be plausible, highly plausible. And that's not easy to write. Make something that seems correct, but really isn't. And that's how the multiple choice item functions. So the question comes up. Let me go back there for a second. Notice there are only three choices, three answer choices. This is always a big question I get in other item writing workshops, but you only need three. All the researchers, item writers, all the books have this in it. A meta-analysis of 80 years of published empirical studies on appropriate number of options to use for multiple choice concludes multiple choice items should consist of three options, one correct option and two plausible distractors. Using more options does little to improve item and test score statistics and typically results in implausible distractors. And what happens is, and now in math, I should say, in math and some of the sciences, it's pretty easy to write a lot of distractors. And in the social studies, literature areas, it's more difficult. But in all those cases, even when there are 4, and I've seen as many as 7 options, once the item statistics are calculated, only 3 of them have been chosen by most of the students. Usually the distractor 4 and 5, which are also harder to write because you've used up your good ideas, except in math you can just keep going probably. But the other distractors the students didn't even bother with because they at least narrowed it down to the top 3 or 4. So you're getting all your responses out of the first 3 anyway. And that's the reason that the 3-option multiple choice test is recommended. Now we need to code each item to a specific learning outcome. So that would be the test item. We have 3 levels of outcomes, and the bottom one makes the test item, like we said. And this would be test item 1.1.1. The next item would be test item 1.1.2, and so forth. So we can track it, we can load it into a program, work with it, and a lot of LMS programs do that. But notice it could also be a constructed response. So you could ask a student, what was this passage mostly about? Write me a paper. And then that would be a constructed response. And likewise, constructed response items can be broken down into multiple choice items. And again, that's another workshop, but I'm just letting you know it can happen. Okay, so we're writing guidelines for the multiple choice items. There are a lot of them, but you're going to have this paper to look over, and some of you may already know a lot of these, but you need to write the item stem as a question, not a statement, as a question. You put the main idea or central idea of what you want to ask in the stem, not in the answer choices. And that means you need to have a complete thought in the stem, and then the answer choices don't have to be full sentences. Number 3, Word the question positively. Avoid negatives such as not or except. That happens a lot, and you can't do that. Make sure there isn't a clue in the stem that gives a clue to the correct answer. Well, that's kind of logical. 5. Make sure, that then should be that. Make sure that only one of the answer choices is the absolutely correct answer. 6. Make the distractor answer choices, the options, equally plausible as possible. And number 7, keep the length of the answer choices about equal. Sometimes a really long, one of the options would be a really long answer. Students have a tendency to pick that as the correct answer. It's just a behavior they have. Number 8, avoid using the answer choice none of the above or all of the above. And we'll talk more about that. Number 9, phrase answer choices positively. Avoid words such as not, except, doesn't, didn't, couldn't, and wouldn't. And we'll talk more about that. And of course, 10 makes sense. Avoid giving clues to the right answer in the item choices. Okay, so we've had the guidelines for writing outcome statements, and we've had guidelines for writing the test items, the multiple choice items. Now we're looking at guidelines for writing just the item stem. So we're breaking all those guidelines down now, so we just focus on item stems, or the questions. Now, if you need it, there's a list of templates for creating item stems, or the questions, in my book on pages 21 to 26. That's a lot of pages, and it's all full of templates that will give you ideas for writing the item stems, and also for writing outcome statements. One of the universities that uses my book for faculty development said that one of the main reasons they get it is because the instructors like the template so much. So they're useful. Okay, these are guidelines for item stem or questions. And this is in the book on page 41, and I kind of shortened it up a little so that the top half of this grid in the book is about stems, and the bottom half is about options. But it's just a nice guide, and I like to think of it as what's the good stuff and what's the bad stuff. So these are good properties, and these are flaws that must be avoided. So the stem is preferably a question. Okay. The question is as clear as possible so the student knows exactly what is being asked. Any directions or instructions included in the stem are as unambiguous and offer clear guidance. Good words. The main or central idea of what you want to ask is in the stem, not in the answer choices. And the question stem is worded positively. And you need to put the main or central idea of what you want to ask in the stem, not in the answer choices. Oh, you know what? I doubled it up here. I guess I thought it was really important. Okay, number 2 over here are flaws that must be avoided. Make sure there are no clues in the question that will help the student choose the correct answer choice. No clues. Negatives such as not or except have been avoided. Okay, if they've been avoided, that's good. The item is not opinion based. There's a reason for that, and we'll talk about that a little more too. The item does not ask a trick question. No trick questions in assessment. Avoid beginning all options with the same words or phrases. If you have to begin them with the same words or phrases, that's an indication that those words or phrases should have been in the stem. Okay. Now let's look at these guidelines for writing the item stem in terms of a little formative test that you can take. Because remember, formative tests are just instructional, really. They're to help get this stuff in longer term memory. So what is the recommended way to write the STEM for multiple choice item? Probably most of you chose make it a question. And why? Well, the question format versus sentence completion is always an issue because a lot of writers want to make a sentence completion where it gives part of the what would be a question, but make it a statement, and then they leave a blank, called fill in the blank. It's really a sentence completion. But here's the problem. If we state that the color of the car is, and then want the student to complete the sentence, they have to go back and restructure that each time. They spend time doing that. The color of the car is blue. The color of the car is green. Plus, that's not how we ask questions. That's not how we talk. So that contributes to issues that would reduce the validity of any response we get from a student. But on the bottom one, what is the color of the car? That's how we always ask questions. What's the color of the car? Oh, red, blue, green, I'll pick one. It doesn't cause the student any of those short-term memory issues that you have with a completion format. So what is the guideline for using negatives such as not or except? Avoid the negatives. Avoid negatives. Why the use of negatives like not and except should be avoided? It requires the student to keep reconstructing in their minds each answer choice, trying to figure out what is correct as well as what is not correct. So it's clouding them in their ability to make a choice. Often students read right through not anyway, when they do that, they forget to use the reverse logic of, well, what is not or what is the exception. So you get valid items by avoiding not and except. Number 3. Okay, the correct answer is something in the STEM gives a clue to the answer, and probably most of you got that. How about number 4? Well, I jumped to that pretty fast and didn't give you much chance, but the answer is STEM and answers choices in any item. That's where cueing or cluing can occur. And students may get to item 13 and how they answer it and what's in there might give them some hints about how they should have answered item 3. So they'll go back and fix it. Now you're getting kind of measurement on two different things that you don't need. You could be better to have another item to give you more information. So be careful that you don't have any clues or cluing either the STEM or the answer choices in any item on the test. Okay, now we're going to look at guidelines for writing answer choices. So we've looked at the whole item, the multiple choice item, and then we looked at the STEM, the question. Now we're looking at the answer choices themselves, the options. And the guidelines for writing answer choices or options in the book are on pages 41 through 43. There are actually 14 of them in there, but I picked out the 7 that are most useful for us today. And one is, these are the main ones. Avoid using the words none of the above or all of the above. That's done a lot. But these answer choices or options, first of all, they conflict with having one absolutely positively correct answer, and they can be clues if the student knows 2 out of the 4, because if 2 are none of the above, the other 2 gotta be. Or if they know that 2 are part of all of the above, then that's a hint that the answer is all of the above. It also requires the students to use a different strategy when they're trying to figure out the answer than when they do for the rest of the items that don't ever have none of the above or all of the above. So it throws them off a little. And we want students to show us the best that they can do, not the worst. So don't use the choice, I don't know. This can't be a plausible distractor. Doesn't make any sense as a distractor. And it doesn't make sense that this could be the correct answer. Don't use non-positive words such as not, except, doesn't, didn't, and wouldn't unless positive phrasing has been considered first. So don't use those until you've tried it without using those. So use of these words are less problematic in the answer choices compared to their use in the stems, because in the stems they always should be avoided. But if the syntax you're using is well crafted, they may be useful in some cases, such as maybe they are more reasonable and logical for a particular item or the need to create fewer items. There are reasons why they might work, but the recommended strategy is to always consider positive phrasing first. It's best to just try to stay away from them. Number 4, avoid using terms such as always, never, none, totally, absolutely, and completely. They set extreme limits and they qualify the answer choices, and thus they can be a clue that they are maybe less likely or more likely to be the correct answer. It's almost like giving a hint. Number 5, avoid the use of terms such as often, sometimes, generally, usually, typically. Again, they qualify the answer choice and then they act like clues, and typically they seem to be more often true. Number 6, don't make a distractor humorous. It can be a distraction to the real intent of the outcome or objective being measured and has no place in a test for which the results are taken seriously. Testing is a serious business. Now here's another one of those little tables that this is actually the bottom half of the table on page 45. The top half dealt with, this one deals with the item options, the other one dealt with the item stems. So again, we got the good stuff and the not good stuff. The good properties, make sure there are no more than 3 answer choices. Okay? Only one of the answer choices is absolutely positively correct. The distractor answer choices need to be of equal plausibility. If they are, okay, that's good. Are the answer choices placed in vertical and in logical or numerical order? Okay, check. The answer choices are phrased positively as much as possible. There are no clues to the right answer, and the content and structure of the answer choices are as homogeneous and parallel as possible. So here's what we want to avoid. This would flaw the item, and again, we've talked about if you have a flawed item, then you're going to have information that won't allow you to make valid decisions. So for the flaws, what we avoid is make sure the phrases none of the above or all of the above are avoided. The choice, and if you're looking back at this like a checklist, the choice I don't know was not used. Negative words such as not, except, doesn't, didn't, and wouldn't were avoided. Limiting and qualifying words such as always, never, none, totally, absolutely, and completely were avoided. Qualifying words such as often, sometimes, generally, usually, and typically were avoided. No distractor is humorous. The number ranges in numerical choices don't overlap. We didn't really talk about that, but that means like if you have an answer that is one of the choices is 1 to 10, then the next choice wouldn't be 10 to 20, it would be 11 to 20. It's a little mistake that crops up in writing items. So this is your checklist, just like we had the checklist for the other for the stems. But here is a multiple choice option checklist that kind of covers it all. Now there's also the quality of the statements that need to be looked at, and we'll look at that later, and that's on page 44 in the book, but we're going to cover it. So just looking at these, it's just a little checklist, and copy this off copy it if you want. It's not in the book like this at all, but it just covers everything we've talked about. So there are no more than 3 answer choices. Check. The phrases none of the above or all of the above were avoided. Check. Only one of the answer choices is absolutely correct. Check. The choice I don't know was not used. Check. The distractor answer choices are of equal plausibility. Check. Negative words such as not, except, doesn't, didn't, and wouldn't were avoided. I might get my out here. Check. The answer choices are placed vertically in a logical or numerical order. Check. Limiting and qualifying words such as always, never, non, totally, absolutely, and completely were avoided. Check. The answer choices are phrased positively as much as possible. Check. Qualifying words such as often, sometimes, generally, usually, and typically were avoided. Check. There are no clues to the right answer. Check. No distractor is humorous. Check. The content and structure of the answer choices are homogeneous and parallel as possible. Get my clicker, whoops. Get my clicker back here. The content, okay, check. The number ranges in numerical choices don't overlap. Check. So if we've got all those checked off, you're in good shape. So let's take a little formative test on the guidelines now for writing answer choices and see if all this repetition has helped. So number 1, how many answer choices? And you probably all chose 3. Number 2, you probably all chose 1. Number 3, and you probably all chose 2. Number 4, hopefully you all chose that one. Number 5, getting a little more in depth here now. So this is cognitively a little more demanding. The answer is it conflicts with the rule of 1 absolutely correct answer. Number 6. Okay, it's A. And again, this was a little more cognitively demanding. They set extreme limits and thus can be a clue. Number 7. Okay, it'd be A. They limit the context of the answer options and can be clues. Number 8. And it's lowest to highest, and it's always like smallest to greatest. You put them in that order so that it's easier for the students to see the answers. If you have low, high, middle, then they reconstruct in their minds low, middle, high as they're thinking about the correct answer. So just to help them along, we keep them in the order from lowest to highest. Number 9. Right, because the distractors have to have a degree of correctness when you're using best. I like using what is the best as the question, but then it is pretty tricky to make the distractors have enough correctness, but not so much that it's the absolutely correct answer. And here's that quality checklist. Now this is on page 44, and it's copyrighted, but again, you can make a checklist like this, and this addresses a little more than just those rules, the guidelines that we talked about. It has some of the syntax information in here. So, number one is item addresses the content and task specified in the outcome statement. Number two, item was written at the stated cognitive level. 3, question is not unnecessarily wordy. That's interesting. There's one and only one clearly correct answer. Okay, we knew that. And the correct answer is not clued by the question. Okay, we knew that. Negatives were avoided except where absolutely necessary. Yep, we talked about that. Question does not contain misleading, ambiguous, or tricky language. Okay, we didn't specifically talk about that, but that makes sense. And the question contains all the information necessary for a response. We did talk about that. And options are independent of each other. No cluing. Okay, that's just a nice way to say it. Options do not contain misleading, ambiguous, or tricky language. We didn't specifically talk about that, but yes, that is a guideline. Options are parallel in structure. We didn't specifically talk about that, but the parallelism means they don't have an extra long sentence, short sentence, or the wordings are very some of the terms, some of the verbs are very different. So the options are of similar length. That helps. Options avoid repetitious wording. Definitely. Distractor options are plausible and reasonable. We talked about that. Options are in logical order. Keep that idea, be in logical order. And there's no option that has the same meaning as another option. There are no all-inclusive options like all of the above, none of the above. And there are no unnecessarily wordy options. That's something to watch. No unnecessarily wordy options. Think about how you can get it down to specifics. And the item is free of grammatical errors. That can affect also some items, some options, and how the student responds. So this is just a nice little quality assurance checklist, whereas the other was a more specific guideline checklist. But I consider these guidelines too, because remember, the bottom line is we want to get good information from our assessments, and it has to be absolutely be valid information, because we're going to use it to make decisions. Okay, that takes care of all the multiple choice type items. Now let's take a look at constructed response items. And yes, there are guidelines for that too, but let's first look at the components of an extended constructed response item. There are other types of response items, some what they call fill in the blanks, but are really sentence completion, and some short responses. But we're talking about here about extended responses where you definitely need a good rubric. So the components are some instructions where the format, how to submit it, and the process are made very clear, and a prompt which contains the information needed for the student to understand exactly what is expected, and then the question or statement, which is the outcome related task the student is to perform, what the student is to respond to, in other words. So here's an example. Instructions are: write a paper 2 to 3 pages, double spaced. You will be graded according to the rubric that you have been provided. This paper counts as 15% of your final grade. Okay, a student's going to know exactly what to do there, and if they don't follow that and come up and say, "Oh, I didn't know I was supposed to do that," and you said, you just tell them I made the instructions very clear, and they won't be able to argue with you. Prompt is next, and here's a prompt, an example. The Committee on Campus Structural Improvement wait, I better read that again. The Committee on Campus Structural Improvement has determined that due to growth, more buildings are needed. A proposal to close the largest student parking lot and put up a new building in its place is being discussed. The administration has determined that this decision will affect only 22% of the on-campus students. So the question that's going to be asked, or the statement that tells them what to do, is write a paper either for or against the proposal. Take a clear position and back up your position with logical arguments and data. Clearly identify the problem that is raised and offer a solution to the problem. Okay, there should be no question in the student's mind here. They don't have to guess. They don't have to try to second guess what you want. So hopefully you will get that. You'll get good papers back. Now the scoring rubric also is good to share. In this case, 80% of your score will be based on the number of points you make to back up your position, and the logic of your argument, and the quality of your arguments. 15% of your score will be based on the quality of the organization of your paper in terms of a beginning, middle, and end, and in terms of a logical transition and connecting ideas. 5% of your score will be based on grammar, punctuation, and spelling. That means all of that scoring rubric is going to have cells that allow the scorer to measure these things. So here are some writing guidelines for extended response. Select these are copyrighted, so I put the copyright at the bottom. Select the SLOs to be measured. If you're trying to test more outcomes than one prompt can accommodate, then you will need to prioritize the outcomes in terms of importance, or possibly make an additional question or statement. 2. Make sure that the outcomes you want to address are reasonable for the length of the response you expect to get. It's better to have a second prompt than to try to cover too many outcomes with one prompt. 3. Give enough information in the prompt, the stimulus, to make the nature of the desired answer clear. Make sure the prompt contains all of the information the student needs in order to understand the task. Don't assume that the student will be able to read between the lines or figure out what might be missing. For example, if the question asks the student to compare and contrast, summarize, explain, or describe, then give enough information in the prompt to support the question so the student will know what you intend when you use those words. And avoid questions that are so broad that a knowledgeable student could write several pages on the subject. For example, what were the causes of the Vietnam War? That might be a good question depending on the course, but that's also something that a Vietnam War veteran could write a book on. Make sure the question or questions, if more than one are needed, contains all the information the student needs. For example, if you expect the student to provide the rationale in addition to taking a position on an argument, then state this in the question or statement. If you expect some type of graphic, then make sure that is clearly asked for. Avoid asking students to tell you how they feel about personal things or to relate personal experiences. Those responses would be difficult to score because they're based on personal, unless the outcome was to have the student demonstrate writing ability rather than to address some specific content. Then, of course, personal stuff is what you would look for. Number 7, use action verbs in the question that encourage extended responses, such as explain. These are action verbs. This is use these action verbs in the questions that encourage extended responses, such as explain, discuss, illustrate, compare, show, describe. And avoid using verbs like name, list, and identify, because those words are likely to encourage the student to make a list or give names or give short answers. Okay, I put an example of an analytic rubric in here. I'm sure you've all seen them, probably used them. The scoring, the scoring scales at the top. What I wanted to point out is that in terms of outcome identification, these would be the GLO level, because these are broad. So written responses are almost always scored at this level because the specific outcome statements are all in here. So this makes sense then. It's not that you don't have specific things. It's just that you taught them how to clarify a position statement, and to be able to do that, you had to teach them some specific things. But you're looking for it based on the specific things based on these cells. Okay, I think that covers it. So here's a little formative quiz for you. Choose the item type that best matches the outcome statement. So we've got the battle: selected response versus constructed response items. Number 1, recognize poor and good written communication skills. Well, it's recognized, so it's probably multiple choice, you think. Now you see that unsure? That's really not necessary unless you had never seen anything that I've talked about. And I was trying to find out, how much do you really know? So you can use the unsure and I don't know in these cases, even though the rule is that guideline is don't use I don't know and unsure. But in the case where it's like exploratory, it's okay to put it in. Number 2. Okay, make your choice. Probably all chose multiple choice. Whoops, is there a 3? I guess I went to number 4. Okay, number 4. Again, the word identify leads you toward multiple choice. Number 5. And probably everyone, most of you at least, went toward written response. Now, if you wanted to make it a multiple choice, there are some templates that I talked about earlier, and here's an example of some. These are all different ways that you could turn a description into smaller pieces to make multiple choice. What or which describes a attitude or technique? What is the description for? What is the best description for? What or which best describes the attitude shared by good communicators? And so I'm taking these same words but putting them into an answer to a question like which description fits and which description is the best for, or which description describes a vision of. So there are a lot of ways to use these templates to write multiple choice items, and many times if you have the choice between, do I want to grade another big paper and I have 300 students in this class, or because I'm going to never get that done adequately, so how can I convert that constructed response to a multiple choice type test, to multiple choice questions? And this is how you do it. That's how the templates can help. Okay, how about this one? I would say written response, except of course, except of course what we just looked at, we could create some multiple choice items. Number 7. I would go for written response, but then again, if I had a big need for it, I could convert these by using the templates. Number 8. I'd go for a written response also, and this emphasizes the words that are in the GLO category. Like you have to be able to analyze something to be able to totally understand it. Oops. Okay, number 9. It didn't matter that I showed the answer ahead of time because this is a no-brainer. That's all it can be. Okay, we're pretty much done now. And thank you for hanging in there. I know this is a lot. For some of you, this may be a review. For some of you, this may be quite a bit of new stuff. In either case, I hope it's laid out well enough that you'll be able to go back and review it. But I wanted to point out something else, that there are steps for the test development that we haven't covered. We've just covered a couple of them. But when I'm hired to go work at a state department or in my job at the state department of the test development company, or helping a district or an institution build tests, this is really what we do. These are the steps. Number 1, we determine the purpose of the test, and of course those are all different purposes: formative, summative, measure knowledge, skills, performance, etc. So we make it very clear the purpose, and then we make the table of specifications. Remember that little table that we talked about? And that shows how many and what types of items we plan to use to measure the outcomes. And that we also called test blueprint. And then we make sure that the item and outcomes match. Because remember, we're given the outcomes or the standards, and they tell us we need test items for this. One university the University of Portland, well, it was the University of Oregon, had a grant, and it was a huge reading comprehension test with full pages for prompts, and they wanted me to write all the items. So I ended up writing almost 3,000 items on that job, and I had to follow all of these steps. And they worked with me, of course, on making sure the items and outcomes match, but I would write draft items, send them, and then and also they expected me to follow the guidelines exactly, because the head guy there knew his stuff, and this was a big contract, and they wanted to make sure everything was absolutely correct. So we'd write the draft items, and then I'd send them back, and they would try the items out and the forms on a small number of students to get input, like we talked about earlier, and think about things like clarity, format, and content. And then that information would be taken back at step 5, and they would revise the items and forms based on that student response, and that they'd use those results then to from the developmental tryout, is what we call it, to revise the test items. So we're in pretty good shape with items now, but they had to be field tested, and both the test items and the forms, and they have to pass an item analysis. You see there it says administer the items and do an item analysis. That's all that statistical analysis of how the item functioned, and it can get pretty involved, and they had to pass that before I get paid. So I had made sure I followed all those guidelines, so I knew they had good items. Now it says expect some item revision after the item analysis results are in. Yes, there always are. Fortunately, I had enough experience with it that I had very few items that had to be revised after the item analysis. But once they were revised, then of course they'd have to be field tested again. But eventually you have a huge batch of really good items, and then you make your final items from that and make your test forms. So that's the whole ball game. And a great portion of what I do is really in the measurement methodology and part is at step 7. So the intended outcome I have at the bottom there, it's small print, but I guess I was just intending to say this. Intended outcome is that a test that produces scores that are valid for their intended interpretation and use. That's what we're after. So we didn't cover this, but just wanted you to know the big picture. Oh, I guess I left step 9. Finalize the live test form and administer it, of course. Okay, now let's move a little bit in the student's viewpoint and talk about metacognition, learning, and the brain. Charles Darwin said, "It is not the strongest of the species that survive, nor the most intelligent, but the ones most responsive to change." And teaching and learning is about brain changing. So here's what the brain looks like with all of its neurons and synapses, and there's firing in there going on, a lot of activity, and it's always going on even when you sleep. And it's called the neural network. And then certain sections of it form schemas. And we could talk about all this in detail, but for today we don't need to. What's important is, and the students need to know this too, is neuroplasticity. And that's the brain's ability to continually learn and reorganize itself as a result of input from the environment. I really like that word, reorganize. If students tell me, "Oh, I can't do this," I say, look, you have neuroplasticity on your side. The brain's going to reorganize itself and keep learning as long as you're giving it input. So you can do this. And then also mention, but there is pruning, because you're going to learn a bunch of stuff. It's going to be in long-term memory. And when it's been in there for a long time, then the neurons that are associated with that learning are naturally pruned based on their non-use. There's a little enzyme called calpain that does this main pruning. But it's important to have pruning in learning, because some things don't need to be in there and they never get used, so it makes room for something new coming in if it gets pruned. But don't worry, your brain doesn't get completely pruned out. But when you get older, that's when more of the pruning occurs. So here we're talking about the brain being able to change and reorganize as a result of input. So learning then we'll call the process of acquiring knowledge and skills. I think that's pretty basic. And memory is a process of retaining the learned knowledge and skills for future use. And we want to retrieve from the brain what we've got stored in there. And that means we're dealing with learning minus forgetting. What you learned minus what you forgot. So practice retrieval. You need to practice retrieval to maximize the learning and minimize forgetting. And I put in there that we need retrieval cues, because when the brain goes in there and tries to retrieve, it likes to have some cues that it can look for, those structures, those schema and those neural structures to pull that information from. We could talk a lot more about this, but for now we just need to get these basics so we can better help students achieve their outcomes. So formative assessment in the memory system looks like this. We get incoming sensory information from everywhere, all of our senses, and we can hang on to it for a couple seconds or less. That's called sensory memory. So we throw it into working memory, which only lasts about 18 seconds, but we're working with it in there. It's like trying to remember a phone number or an address. We keep repeating it over and over because the memory, they work together. The sensory memory is still there, and the working memory is trying to hang on to it, and it requires rehearsal to keep it in that working memory. Another name for working memory is short-term memory, but really working memory is a better word. So rehearsal keeps it in working memory longer for better transfer to the long-term memory. So there it goes. It's going to long-term memory. It's going to stay in there as long as it's used. But what keeps it in there is and they work back and forth. What's keeping it there is working memory, keeping going back and retrieving information. Because when you need something in long-term memory, when you're retrieving it and pulling it out to use it, you're going to throw it up into the working memory, and that's what you work with. So it's a back and forth for both of these. There's some, of course, connection between sensory memory with cues and long-term memory. Now, let's focus on the long-term memory part. Repeated activation of the neurons in long-term memory strengthens them and makes memory access easier. Repeated activation. So that's the key to learning as we see it in outcome-based education, and now in the formational. So here are some cautions, though. To learn, students must transfer information from working memory, where it is consciously processed, to long-term memory, where it can be stored and later retrieved. Now, students have limited working memory capacities, and they can be overwhelmed by tasks. The students can be overwhelmed by tasks that are cognitively too demanding. So we have to consider that in the outcomes we're expecting them to achieve, how we assess it, the importance of it to them, and the importance of it to the course and the curriculum and expectations. So understanding new ideas can be impeded if students are confronted with too much information at once. Those are the cautions. Overwhelmed by the task, too much information at once. But students also think they can multitask, but the brain cannot successfully perform 2 or more cognitive tasks simultaneously. It just doesn't do it. What happens is, and I know some students can do this, they can watch TV and study, and they go really fast. They can alternate real fast between those 2 things. My wife is really good at this. She can do about 3 things and alternate between, but you're still losing some, because by the time you're here, something's happened there, and you can't replace it. It's gone. So you'd have to go back and relearn it here. So that's what multitasking means. You can flip back and forth real fast. And some students can be watching TV, reading a book, and doing some other task, and they just go from one to the other real fast. So there's no such thing as really multitasking, doing everything at the same time. It's always has to go through this process. So that brings us to the topic of metacognition, because metacognition is a set of skills that enable learners to become aware of how they learn and to evaluate and adapt these skills to becoming increasingly effective at learning. Now, in transformative education, as there's this, you hear a lot about now in this summit, it's going to address, I think, these points. Another definition is metacognition allows people to take charge of their own learning. It involves awareness of how they learn, an evaluation of their learning needs, generating strategies to meet these needs, and then implementing the strategies. And I know really good teachers work this into their instruction, both of these definitions. So that also brings up critical thinking, and I like to put it as a metacognitive strategy for students. And I wrote out some questions that I got from the literature, and particularly from one source that I'll cite, and I formed them into statements and then into questions because I thought it worked better. So as a metacognitive task, this is what the student could do to be thinking critically. Am I accepting the first conclusion that sounds reasonable? Am I failing to look at both sides of an issue? Am I discounting new evidence that confirms my personal ideas? Am I reasoning from passion rather than logic? Am I failing to support statements with evidence? Am I failing to support claims with evidence? Am I failing to deduce and infer conclusions from available facts? Am I failing to follow the evidence to an unbiased conclusion? Now, I dug those out of papers by Willingham, and they weren't listed like this, but this is how I presented it. But all of these are definitely identifiable in his work. So now we've got metacognitive thinking and critical thinking, and here are two principles that apply. The more you practice, the better you get. So you learn to think critically and get better at it when you practice thinking critically. And you need adequate content background or knowledge. So knowing stuff is important, because you can't think critically about things that you know little about. And you can't solve problems if you don't know enough to be able to figure out what solution is called for. So the whole structure of the outcomes is necessary. Okay, here's a little, what I call a pre-instruction test. It's formative, so you're going to take this test. And this is what you could do if you're just introducing new material, and you tell the students, look, this is just to help you get acquainted. Don't worry, it's a formative test, so you're doing it so you can improve your learning. And these are on supported facts, research-supported facts about teaching, learning, and thinking. The question is, how productive for learning is it for the student to reread, highlight, and underline text and spend a lot of time reading over the notes and the text? And is it highly productive, moderately productive, or minimally productive? It's minimally productive. Students most used and preferred study strategies of rereading text, rapid repetition, which is called mass practice, highlighting, underlining, and sustained poring over of notes and text are the least productive methods for learning and getting information into long-term memory. How would you answer this question? Okay, I'm guessing a lot of you chose highly powerful, because formative testing or quizzing is a powerful instructional strategy, because it takes formative quizzes and getting feedback, because taking formative quizzes and getting feedback provides opportunities for students to get information into long-term memory and retrieve it. Magic word, retrieve it. Retrieval is a powerful learning strategy because each time information is retrieved, the long-term memory neurons get stronger. Next question. Okay, it is a good form of retrieval practice. I'm suspecting most of you saw the word retrieval and chose that. So reflections such as asking questions like, what did I do? What happened? How did it work out? What would I do differently the next time? Is a good form of retrieval practice because the student needs to retrieve knowledge from memory, connect to new experiences, and figure out what to do differently the next time. This is my favorite. Okay, it requires repetition and retrieval practice. Self-testing with flashcards requires repetition and retrieval practice, which is how the brain learns. To get the maximum benefit from self-testing with flashcards, the student needs to space out their practice with the cards. space it out over time, and not cram all the information into their brains just before the exam. And which, in that case, the information would quickly expire after the exam. I mean, research all shows that. So, flashcards are extremely valuable. There are huge programs on the web where students can go in and make their own flashcards. And a couple of the programs got so filled up with the flashcards with the options that instructors started complaining that, hey, they're giving away the answers to my test. But if they're learning that from the flashcards, I suppose that's okay. I usually make some flashcards with PowerPoint for one of my stats courses where students are supposed to know stuff because they had to the previous course, but they get there and they only know about half. So I have them do the flashcards as an introduction to the course because it reviews the previous information so well. And remember that retrieval strengthens memory and interrupts forgetting. Okay, that'll do it for today. Oh, I do have one other slide. It's just an afterthought. But I wanted you to know that Stylus Publications said that anybody who's attending the summit can use this promo code to get 20% off plus free shipping if you're interested in getting my book. And here's their link, Stylus Pub, but you can just type in the connecting the dots or Stylus or Amazon. Okay, so the code is IN4OBE. Now, my final thought. After doing these slides, it occurred to me that this whole summit is about transformational OBE approach. And here are some features that I ferreted out of some readings. And I know they're being covered by all the experts on it in different sessions. But for what pertains to what we talked about today, I thought it was interesting that one of the features of the transformational OBE is that attaining outcomes are not bound by time and calendar constraints. Now that's a big thing because that means you do what's needed when it's needed. And you're not bound in by like a semester. So that's interesting to address. And the focus is on achieving outcomes according to ability. I wasn't exactly sure what that meant, but it must mean that somewhere along the way you can determine with the student's ability and then focus on the outcomes for that student based on that ability. And another point was that achievement is supported by flexible time frames, and not bound by closed structured teaching time. Now that's a biggie, and I know at the university level I know this is being practiced actually quite a bit, and I don't know if it's, I don't know how far it's gotten down into like the high schools and elementary schools, but it's an interesting idea that this restriction is not applied. So the other one is learners are encouraged to form own insights and create own solutions. Well, I know a lot of teachers try to get them to do that anyway, but this is a main feature of OBE, transformational OBE. So we need to consider what does that look like when we write outcomes and assessments. All of these, that's my interest, is what does this look like in terms of outcomes and assessments, and when they need to be given, when they can be done, and how we use the results. So this other point is that learners advance through the system when they are able to demonstrate attainment of the desired outcomes. Well, that makes pretty good sense, but I've had students, graduates, I've taught a lot of graduate courses, and I've had graduate students tell me, you know, I'm taking this course, and not my course, we're talking about another course, but they said, and I could finish everything in 2 months and be done, and yet I have to sit in class another month. Why don't they change the system? Well, that student could probably finish their degree program in 2 years. So this makes sense. How it works out logistically and university rule-wise remains to be seen. Learners are assessed continuously and facilitated to attain these desired outcomes. Can't argue with that. There are so many ways to assess, and it's part of the learning process, so of course it should be continuous. Okay, well, those are just some extra thoughts that I found interesting and wanted to share. So thank you all so very much for participating, and enjoy the rest of the summit. It's going to be excellent. Signing off.